Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. I am back in the region, actually. So it's good evening for people here. Good afternoon for people back in the States, and somewhere in between for those in between. My name is Bassam Haddad. I will be interviewing, conversing with Mouin Rabbani in this 26th teach in under the title Gaza War Chronicles, which is part three of Gaza War Chronicles, and with the topic Gaza or Genocide and Justice. We are back with Mouin Rabbani, who has been a staple of our analysis on the ongoing war on Gaza, the ongoing genocide, the ongoing atrocities, the unfathomable process that we have been witnessing for 6 months. This is again a collaborative project that includes 22 research institutes as well as university centers and units. We are very excited that all of our material not only is available on palestineincontext.org, but is also being assigned in classrooms in ways that we did not anticipate. We are also working on producing shorter versions of much of our teachings for easier curation by educators and people who just would like to learn more, who would be able then to actually pinpoint exactly what they're looking for and find it. Before too long, let me just say a couple words about Mouin Rabbani before we get into our discussion of genocide and justice. Mouin Rabbani, for those who still do not know who he is a researcher, analyst, and commentator specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the contemporary Middle East. He has, among other positions, previously served as principal political affairs officer with the Office of the UN Special Envoy for Syria, head of Middle East with Marty Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, and senior Middle East analyst and special advisor on Israel Palestine with the International Crisis Group. Rabbani is co-editor of Jadaliya, where he also hosts the Connections podcast and edits its Quick Thoughts feature, which is a very important feature that has been running on Jadaliya for the past few months, addressing the war on Gaza. He's also managing editor and associate editor of the Journal of Peace Building and Development and a contributing editor of Middle East Report. He is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies and at Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN. A graduate of Tufts University and Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, Rabbani has published, presented, and commented widely on Middle East issues, including most major print, television, and digital media. Mouin, welcome back again. We would like to... Hala, hala. We would like to get started with addressing any broad comments you may have, after which I will be asking you a few questions, which we have announced that we will be addressing, and they will deal with a basic update about 180 plus days after the onslaught. We will also address the ICJ ruling and the new provisional decisions. And we will also look at the nature of the killing that we are witnessing in Gaza. We'll also look at US complicity and the regional dimensions. And we will close with a couple of words about what's next. So I'll leave you with the floor.
Thank you, Bassam. Very good to be with you again, and thank you for your kind words of introduction. I prepared a few introductory remarks to help set the stage for our discussion, so I'll just read those out. As Israel's war against the Gaza Strip passes the half-year mark, the one certainty is that the region, and to some extent the world, has been irrevocably changed. The most obvious is in the Gaza Strip. Gaza's Palestinians have been subjected to a relentless, months-long genocidal assault that has claimed tens of thousands of lives, primarily non-combatant men, women, and children. Much of that occupied territory has also been systematically razed to the ground by high explosives and bulldozers. As one observer has noted, Israel has destroyed everything in the Gaza Strip except Hamas. Less visible, but no less evident, are changes in and about Israel. It now and forever stands formally and plausibly accused of genocide before the International Court of Justice. As a result, it can no longer use the Holocaust perpetrated by Germany in Europe during the 20th century as a shield to deflect and denounce criticism and condemnation of its policies this century towards Palestinians and others in the Middle East. No less importantly, Israel's image, carefully cultivated over the decades as an omnipotent and omniscient regional superpower, a reliable Western proxy in the Middle East, capable of defending Western interests in the region, was shattered on the 7th of October last year. Regardless of how this war ends, Israel's vulnerabilities and limitations, and its utter dependence on those who thought they could reliably depend upon it to promote their own security and prosperity, have been exposed. This will have significant consequences for Israel's role in Western strategic and geopolitical calculations. In terms of its regional dimensions, this war has been consistently expanding throughout the past 6 months. The term used to describe this dynamic thus far has been controlled escalation, but with Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and now Iran directly involved, and most recently an Israeli attack on sovereign Iranian territory in the Syrian capital Damascus, a full scale regional conflict appears increasingly likely. But it is not only regional powers that are involved. The United States, United Kingdom, and several other Western states are now also directly involved in military operations, primarily in the Red Sea region, but also in Syria and Iraq. From the perspective of the international community, the West is waging war in the Middle East not to resolve conflict, but to ensure that Israel can continue to pulverize the Gaza Strip and its inhabitants without interruption or distraction. The reputational damage is massive and permanent. Western finger wagging lectures about human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are definitively a thing of the past. Western policy since the 7th of October, consisting primarily of unconditional and unqualified support for Israel and of arming it to the teeth with the most advanced weaponry available, has also laid bare the irreconcilable contradictions between the West's rules based international order on the one hand and an international system governed by international law, norms, and the decisions of international institutions applied to all without distinction on the other. It is increasingly recognized that the West's pretensions to global leadership and universal values lie dead and buried in the rubble of the Gaza Strip. This development is first and foremost the responsibility of the United States, and particularly its leader, Joe Biden. His deeply personal, ideological, and passionate political commitment to Israel has led him to stand shoulder to shoulder with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his even more extreme cabinet colleagues throughout the past 6 months. Through thick and thin, impervious to accusations of hypocrisy, and openly contemptuous of Palestinian life, Biden has almost single handedly demolished the West's position throughout the globe. The damage is compounded because every indication suggests Biden doesn't care about the damage done, whether to his country or to his own career, and considers it a price worth paying.
Are you done?
Yes, I'm done. Sorry, I thought you
No,
were.
the way you finished, basically, I thought that you were cut off. The intonation wasn't there, but I guess it's a
Gonna start again?
yeah. Start again, do the whole thing again, and just finish in a manner that signals that you're finished.
All right.
Mouin, thank you very much for this introduction. There's a ton of things that I'd like to ask, and I am sure that others would like to chime in. By the way, folks, if you would like to ask a question in the coming few minutes, you can begin doing that on YouTube by writing out the word question, and then we'll try as much as possible to field some of these questions. We promised Mouin an hour, so we will try to stick to that as much as possible. First, Mouin, let me start by asking you to share with us some of the more recent developments regarding the ICJ and the UN Security Council decisions, as well, of course, as the US response, which is extremely odd given how it participated in putting together some of these decisions, but ended up abstaining and basically undermining it after the fact.
Yes.
So let's start with the ICJ. A lot of people who are joining us, and I know this from interacting with folks both at a university setting and beyond, and socially speaking, a lot of people have tuned out in terms of what the ICJ um, is doing, especially after the provisional measures were issued early on. And then a lot of people are not quite certain as to where we are in the process. So if you can just orient us a little bit and then address the more recent ones and their implications before we get to the UN, if you don't mind.
Well, if it's all the same to you, I'd like to start with the UN first because that resolution actually came before the ICJ's
Sure.
most recent decision and featured to some extent in it. So if that's fine with you, I'll proceed from there.
Absolutely.
What happened at the United Nations Security Council is that after the US vetoed three resolutions calling for a ceasefire, and after the US additionally vetoed a Russian amendment to a different draft resolution, uh, to a different resolution that called for a ceasefire, and after the US's own resolution um, making a very convoluted appeal for a temporary ceasefire that was entirely dependent on other factors was vetoed by the Russians and the Chinese. This time you had a draft resolution that was proposed to the Security Council, not by the United States, not by Russia or China, but by 10 members of the Security Council, known collectively as the elected 10. A very different set of states, including close US allies such as Japan and South Korea, European countries such as Malta, number of African and Asian and Latin American states. So, really, a group of countries that had very little in common besides representing the collective will of the international community that there needs to be a ceasefire, that the ceasefire needs to be immediate, and that the ceasefire needs to be unconditional. And what happened is that in this case, the resolution called for both an immediate ceasefire for the duration of the Muslim month of Ramadan and for an unconditional release of hostages. And it did not make those two demands dependent upon each other. So, what did the US do? It took its time negotiating the text and so on, so that the resolution was finally put to the Security Council halfway through the month of Ramadan. At the last minute, the US demanded an additional change of wording from, I believe, a permanent ceasefire to a sustainable, lasting ceasefire, something to that effect. The resolution passed with 14 out of 15 votes. And the US, of course, couldn't bring itself to vote for this, so it abstained. But that means there was no veto, and the resolution passed. The moment the resolution passed, the Biden administration and its various spokesmen and leaders started explaining to us that this resolution is in fact meaningless because, in their words, it's non binding, which is absolute nonsense. Every United Nations Security Council resolution is by definition binding. And there was a case before the International Court of Justice in 1970 or 1971, in which the court, which is the ultimate arbiter of United Nations procedures, made very clear that there is no hierarchy in Security Council resolutions, that each of the Security Council's resolutions is equally binding on all member states of the UN. So the US, immediately sought to consign this resolution to irrelevance. And then, as if to emphasize its point, later that same day, the Biden administration certified to Congress that Israel, which, as we'll discuss in a minute, stands plausibly accused of genocide before the International Court of Justice, is using the weapons it has received from the United States in a manner entirely consistent with both international law and US domestic law. And in addition, is not using any of those weapons to inhibit the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip. So that's the Security Council resolution. The following week, the International Court of Justice, responding to a further appeal or request from South Africa, which is the state that initiated the proceedings against Israel before the court at the end of December. Basically, the South Africans stated to the court that the situation has significantly changed since the court in late January issued its initial provisional measures, and that there was therefore a need for additional ones to be issued by the court. Just by way of summary, what the court did in January is it had to assess whether South Africa's accusations against Israel were plausible or implausible. It did not have to determine whether Israel is or is not guilty of genocide, but it had to determine whether there was a sufficiently serious case presented by South Africa that Israel had to answer. And it determined that it did. So its decision to move forward with the case rather than to dismiss it can be seen as something akin to an indictment. And issued provisional measures. Of course, the court does not have mechanisms to implement its provisional measures. It called upon Israel to undertake a number of actions. Only the Security Council can enforce court decisions, and the United States, being a member of the Security Council, of course, means that court decisions against Israel will never be enforced. But nevertheless, this time, South Africa went back to the court um, uh, with an appeal given the sharply deteriorating conditions in the Gaza Strip, and particularly incipient famine in the northern Gaza Strip. And the court examined these issues, and it determined, first of all, that there has been a substantial change in the circumstances in the Gaza Strip since the court issued its initial order in late January. And second of all, that there was a genuine urgency for the court to intervene once again before the full proceedings, the full hearing of the case start. And it issued three provisional measures, the most important of which is that it called upon Israel to immediately stop preventing the entry of humanitarian goods and supplies into the Gaza Strip, particularly overland, and called on Israel to cooperate fully with the United Nations and UN agencies to allow them to distribute aid. And this was, I think, so several things can be read into this decision. The first is that implicitly the court was making the point that Israel had essentially violated and ignored the provisional measures that were announced in January, and that there was therefore a need for further ones. Secondly, the court recognized that there had been a dramatic deterioration in conditions within the Gaza Strip and an urgency for it to act further, and it therefore issued additional measures. And this can also be seen as kind of an implicit criticism or condemnation of Israel's campaign of vilification against the United Nations Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, and those states that took a decision to sever funding to the agency on the basis of unfounded Israeli allegations. There is one more aspect of the court that I found particularly interesting, is that South Africa now has, for the third time, asked the court to order a cessation of hostilities in the Gaza Strip. I wasn't expecting it to do so. Um, First, because the court doesn't was not asked to issue a view on the legitimacy of Israel's military operations. Secondly, because it has, in previous cases involving genocide in Bosnia and more recently in Myanmar, refrained from calling for a cessation of hostilities. And third of all, and this is the only reason given by the court for rejecting South Africa's ceasefire appeal. Third reason is that Hamas is not a state and is therefore not a signatory to the Genocide Convention. And the court noted that if it were to issue such an order, it would not bind all members involved in this armed conflict. But nevertheless, seven of the judges, just one short of half of them, issued separate opinions stating that, in their view, the court should have endorsed South Africa's request for a ceasefire. They gave various reasons for saying so, the most important of which was that, in their view, none of the court's provisional measures can be implemented in the absence of a comprehensive cessation of hostilities. Two more minor points is that on this occasion, even the Ugandan judge who sided with Israel in January went along with the majority this time, and the only judge that voted against any of the provisional measures, two out of the three, was the judge appointed by Benjamin Netanyahu to sit on the bench for this particular case, pursuant to ICJ regulations. The final point is that, once again, I found the separate opinion issued by the German judge to be the most interesting. In January, in his separate opinion, he expressed considerable skepticism about South Africa's allegations against Israel, but then concluded that South Africa had presented such overwhelming evidence with respect to the intent component of genocide by way of voluminous statements by Israeli leaders and so on, that essentially that left him with no choice but to vote along with the majority. In this case, he took the position that he initially did not believe that the court should issue additional provisional measures, because if it did so, that would indicate that the court already believes that Israel was violating previous court rulings, and that this would disadvantage Israel when it came to holding the full hearings on the genocide case later down the line. But nevertheless, this time too, he concluded there has been such a dramatic deterioration in the situation, and there is such an urgency of addressing that dramatic deterioration, that he felt he was compelled to vote along with the majority.
You did it again, Mouin. I didn't
What?
know that. I didn't know that you were finished.
Well, I have to adjust my intonation.
Inter-
Apologies.
Thanks, Mouin. Can you tell us a little bit before we move to the next topic if you think anything will come of the efforts to expand the number of countries who will be affected by the ICJ rulings?
Well, the ICJ rulings are binding upon each and every signatory to the Genocide Convention, and for that matter, UN member states, and as a matter of principle. But in this case, I think if you were to contrast the January rulings with the latest rulings, these latest ones seem much more specifically directed at Israel and the conduct of its government and military. Whereas in January, they also included orders for basically all signatories to the convention, and that the earlier ones have been taken as an admonition um, against against states that that same day began severing funding to UNRWA. But I think it does have an indirect effect, which is that Israel is plausibly accused of genocide. The court has now strengthened its provisional measures against Israel. So it places these Western governments that have been offering unqualified support for Israel, people like US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, whose initial response to this case was that it was meritless and ridiculous and should be dismissed out of hand. Well, it wasn't. And in fact, the case has been strengthened. So it gives added motivation for public opinion in these Western states, for decision makers and politicians and elites in these member states to increase the pressure on their governments to cease their complicity with a plausibly genocidal campaign waged by Israel in the Gaza Strip. And in fact, in the United Kingdom, we've already seen this week a letter signed by 600 um, senior judges and lawyers and so on, including the former president of the UK Supreme Court, calling on the government to cease its delivery of arms to Israel so that it would not be violating its obligations under international law. So I think these decisions have definite political and moral impact. But at the same time, I think we have to be realistic. They're not going to change anything on the ground in the immediate or short term.
Thanks, Mine. Let's talk a little bit before we move on to what is going on the ground in terms of the wanton gratuitous killing, as well as the emergence of all the news and analysis about AI,
Mhm.
um, basically handling some of these strikes and so on. Uh, the United States is in a really odd position today, in the sense that everyone who is watching and paying attention is seeing two things. They're seeing an increasing number of statements that call for caution, or even are critical of the conduct of the war by, or conduct of the, I guess, slaughter by Israel on the one hand. But at the same time, we keep seeing the continuation of arms shipments, sales, what have you, and support in material terms. Um, what do you make of this? I mean, there's been a ton of analysis that tries to unpack this, but what should we make of this?
Well, my initial response would be to say words are cheap. You can say whatever you want as often as you want, but if there's a thorough disconnect between what you say and what you do, your words can be safely ignored, and the focus should very much be on your actions rather than on your statements. Just going back to the Security Council resolution that we just discussed, I think that's a perfect example of the Biden administration speaking out of both sides of its mouth. On the one hand, given growing criticism, not only from among US public opinion and core constituencies of the Democratic Party, but even senior Democratic senators and representatives in Congress, it felt it wasn't in a position to yet again veto a resolution. And so it, it sought to pacify these constituencies by abstaining on the resolution. But immediately thereafter, it sought to pacify Israel and its flunkies and its lobbies and so on by indicating that it considers the resolution non-binding and for all intents and purposes meaningless. And then spokesmen were trotted out to say that they neither expect nor are calling for a change in Israeli policy. So I think the real issue is we have to look at what the Biden administration is doing in terms of actions. Yes, Biden can express his outrage and disappointment and all the rest of it over Israeli conduct. And I should note, explicit, clear condemnation has been entirely absent. Not a single instance of that happening during the past 6 months. But when you express these sentiments of frustration and disapproval and anger with Israel, while you're busy signing off on ever larger arms deliveries to Israel, that to me indicates that we really should be focusing on what is being done and much less so on what is being said.
All right. Well, why then are we hearing this today? I mean, if it's something that we've all, I mean, many of us at least, have anticipated that this will be a duplicitous approach, and it's not that difficult to figure out. Why is it happening now? Is it a function of domestic politics to an extent? Is it a function of the growing isolation of Israel globally? I mean, and growing is an understatement here. Um, or is it a function of uh, signaling, like wanting to signal while continuing to provide the same sort of support, signaling something to the Israeli government or something else?
I think it's all of the above, as we were just discussing. I do think that U.S. domestic politics are playing a role in these issues. I think at least as important, and probably more important, is isolation, perhaps less so of Israel on the world stage, even though it has effectively transformed itself once again into a pariah state. But I would say the isolation of the United States on the global stage. And, even in the Security Council, even its closest ally, the United Kingdom, is no longer voting with it on such issues. You know, the US vetoes, and its most loyal ally abstains, can't bring itself to vote with the United States. And so the isolation of the US internationally is extremely visible and extremely stark. And it's reaching the point where it's less a question of isolation and increasingly one where the US is becoming a global laughingstock because of the way that it's approaching this conflict. Regarding your last point, I do think that in the minds of some U.S. decision makers, that they think that if they simply say these things, that it may have an impact on Israeli conduct and make Israeli conduct less embarrassing for the United States. But Israel takes exactly the same attitude that I just described myself, which is they don't care what people say because they understand when words are not matched by actions, the words are meaningless and it's only the actions that count. And finally, as a number of articles have analyzed, that Biden's attitude towards Israel is that not quite apart from his passionate attachment to Israel, that his view is that if the United States wants to influence Israeli conduct, this isn't done by public criticism or condemnation. This is by ensuring that, at least in the public perception, there is no daylight between the United States and Israel, and that the best way to maneuver Israel is to hold it in a very tight embrace, a so called bear hug. Well, we have 6 months of evidence to demonstrate that when you go out of your way to repeatedly ensure there's no daylight between the United States and Israel, and you give Israel everything it wants, and you avoid any public criticism or condemnation of Israel, then the consequence, the conclusion is that Israel will continue doing whatever it wants because it knows it doesn't have to take any differences expressed by the United States seriously and can simply ignore them. But that's, again, assuming that there are serious differences between these two governments. And of course, there are differences, some more serious than others. But I think at the end of the day, we have to also recognize that the United States, and particularly this administration, sees Israel as an extension of itself, and sees Israeli success as American success, and Israeli failure as reflecting negatively on the United States itself.
Do you think that this sort of behavior, which is basically carrying on with the killing, as well as all sorts of other actions, such as what we've witnessed in Syria a couple of days ago with the bombing of the Iranian consulate, as well as the bombing and the strike against the World Central Kitchen caravan, which is just another incident in the wanton killing that's taking place. It's just that because it hit a nerve, because of the actual identity of the targets, it's getting a lot more outrage and press and so on. Do you think these sorts of developments, given that they are undermining various rules of engagement, norms of warfare, laws of warfare, do you think this is something that at least the U.S. is aware of, and the Biden administration is aware of, and sort of assumes that it could ride the wave and come back from it, or do you think this is something that will actually cause or propel some sort of a movement to actually adjust those and adjust the way international laws of such variety apply?
Well, again, as many others have noted, the Palestinians are always a canary in the coal mine. Israeli policy towards the Palestinians is kind of the test case. This is the guinea pig that demonstrates whether these kinds of things can be more generalized. So both the U.S. and Israel have a genuine interest and commitment to rewriting international law, and to basically making things that have been prohibited, certainly since the Second World War, in other cases, since the dawn of mankind, to making them acceptable modes of conduct, basically to shred many of the basic protections that exist in international law. You mentioned the World Central Kitchen case, the murder of 8 people, 8 staff members of WCK, including 7 foreign staff. I think this was a very significant hit by Israel, not because it's any different than what they've been doing consistently for the past 6 months, but because this time they hit foreign citizens, people who have, in contrast to the tens of thousands of Palestinians, people who have names, people who have faces, people who have members of parliament representing their grieving families, and so on. And so there is not only the outrage that Israel is now showing the same contempt for Western lives that it is showing for Palestinian lives, but more importantly, all the attention on this one case in which, 3 cars clearly identified, whose movements and activities were very closely coordinated with the Israeli military, shot to pieces over the course of 2.5 kilometers until Israel ensured each and every member of that convoy was killed. It's significant not because that's an unusual modus operandi for the Israeli military, but because it has shined a spotlight on what Israel has been doing systematically towards everyone else in the Gaza Strip, for many months. And so this, I think, could have an impact, because prior to this incident, the Biden administration not only knows exactly what's going on, but has been shielding Israel from accountability for what's going on, and has been supplying the weapons and ordnance that allow all of this to go on. But I think this case, in exposing a broader pattern of Israeli conduct that people will now have to start paying attention to, that may, I think, have an impact. As far as the Israeli bombing of U.S. of Iranian diplomatic facilities and the Syrian capital Damascus is concerned, that's also a huge deal because diplomatic premises have been considered inviolable for centuries, if not longer. And this is another, it's like systematically attacking hospitals. The rule book of international law, the rule book of the laws of warfare are being purposefully shredded to pieces in real time before our very eyes. And those like the United States, who like to present themselves as the authors and guardians of this order, are directly complicit in shredding it. So, if it's now going to become acceptable to launch air raids against foreign diplomatic missions in third countries, it's going to be a brave new world.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about the wanton killing, the kinds of videos we've been witnessing,
Mm.
which are just as heartbreaking as all other videos about what's happening in Gaza. Do you assume or think that this sort of killing, based on these or the recent stories and news about particular zones that are forbidden,
The kill zones.
the kill zones, as well as the AI systems that are said to be handling a lot of the strikes, something that is published in a couple of places, including 972 magazine,
Mm.
as well as the actual sharing of these videos and images with the world that demonstrate the strike that the strikes have actually been carried out against civilians that are unarmed. In the case of the several young men walking Khan Yunis and other couple other
Mm.
similar cases, we actually see literally everything before, during, and after.
Mm.
Uh, a lot of people try to explain this. What do you make of it? What do you make of this? Even at this point, after 32 to 33,000 Palestinians killed, with more than 76,000 injured and maimed,
Mm.
with the global isolation of Israel and both, of course, the United States, how it's unfathomable that this is still going on and being documented by the party that's carrying it out.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a casualty rate of 32 to 33,000 people. Um, uh, Israel and many of its apologists throw to the wind assessments by US intelligence, by international organizations, even by Israeli military intelligence, that the figures produced by the Palestinian Ministry of Health have proven to be consistently reliable. But nevertheless, Israel's apologists refer to this as the Hamas run health ministry and cast doubt on the figures produced by that ministry. In this case, I think they may have a point because over the course of the past 6 months, the capacity of this ministry to continue compiling accurate data has been significantly degraded. And it's therefore, I would like to point out, very likely that the number of dead and wounded may be not significantly lower than is being reported, but significantly higher than is being reported. In other words, statistics that do not reach this ministry, the many thousands of men, women, and children buried and now decomposing under the rubble of the Gaza Strip, those are not included in these statistics. So I just wanted to start off with that observation. To return to your question, I think it's entirely appropriate to discuss, these kill zones, the videos, gruesome snuff videos that have emerged of showing people being deliberately blown to pieces or shot dead by snipers, even as they're walking unarmed and posing no threat to anyone, or in a number of cases, even waving white flags. I think the investigative reporting into Israel's use of artificial intelligence systems for targeting and so on is to be lauded. But having said that, I do think that we need to maintain our focus not on the means that are being used to implement policy, but on the policy itself that is being implemented by Israel in the Gaza Strip. In other words, if you look at this important investigative report published by 972 magazine about Israel's use of artificial intelligence for targeting, we find out that Israel has relaxed rules of engagement so that effectively anyone who was in any way connected with the Hamas movement, or with, if I'm not mistaken, or with the government in the Gaza Strip, is considered a legitimate target. And it is also now considered legitimate to bomb these people with high explosives when they're enter their homes and could have up to 20 family members on those sites. So the real story here is not the means used to destroy these lives, but the policy of destroying these lives. And I think it's very important to keep the focus on that. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. I actually, like you and others. I mean, there are things that we can speculate on and know for almost a fact, and there are other things that that are just difficult to even speculate on. And this is something that is just unbelievable when you are actually watching
Mm,
what actually in reality makes a party culpable when you're actually watching it and they are offering it up. I
mm.
mean, that sort of brazen act is something for the ages, and I'm assuming we will learn more and more with time, even perhaps through archives. What was going on? What were the machinations behind that? Even if a good deal of the answer is available to us, the impunity with which Israel acts and with which the
The
US is
issue.
able to
Mm,
cover. Um, all right, let me go to the regional setting.
mm,
Now, for many months, we've been witnessing the United States and Israel addressing the question of separately of the expansion of the war, where the U.S. is not interested in that, is trying to avoid it, and where Israel seems to be a bit more um, encouraged to actually potentially do that, given that this moment, the October 7th and after moment, is an opportune moment to do what, again, Rumsfeld said after the 9/11 attacks, to sweep it all up, as he wrote in that quick note that was then accessed by others.
mm. He
Uh,
did quick thoughts too.
Notes. So today and in the past week, we have witnessed, and I'm sure that those who are following know, those who are not, probably it doesn't, it doesn't actually catch their radar, or the radar doesn't catch those events. But Israel has been striking Syria repeatedly. Sometimes Hezbollah operatives, at others Iranian ones, and now it has struck the entire building that came down in Mazzi, the Iranian consulate, with an apparently important senior member, Iranian official
Several senior officers. Mm,
officer. So, given that this is happening now, at a point where it seems that the US is hoping to, quote unquote, as actually Rumsfeld said, or, well, Donald Trump said, not Rumsfeld, to wrap it all up.
Mhm.
What do you think was the intention behind this particular escalation on the one hand? And second, given that if Iran responds, it will fall for the trap.
Mhm.
If it responds in kind at that same level, it will fall for the trap, which is not in the interest of Iran, because perhaps more than Hezbollah and maybe other parties, Iran is not looking for an all out war.
Mhm.
What is the predicament of Iran whereby if it responds in kind, it will probably satisfy Israel's objectives and will actually not be the victor in at least in terms of capacity at this point. And if it doesn't do anything, of course, it's some sort of an additional humiliation. Wh- what do you think might be Iran's response? Some say it should simply renew its deterrence without provoking Israel further.
Well, this is actually one area of significant policy differences between the United States and Israel. When the Palestinians conducted their October 7th attacks within southern Israel, the U.S. Response was to Israel, we stand shoulder to shoulder with you, unconditionally, without qualification. The Gaza Strip is yours. Have your way with it. But we do not want a broader regional conflict. We want to ensure that this does not develop into yet another war between Israel and Lebanon. We don't want any of these other, fragile regional processes to be undermined and destroyed by what's happening between Israel and the Palestinians. And to provide additional comfort to the Israeli proxies, the Americans sent several aircraft carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean. Um, in their view, to deter Hezbollah from getting involved in this conflict. That, of course, failed because on October 8th, Hezbollah began launching attacks on Israel in solidarity with the Palestinians. And for the past 6 months, there have been daily skirmishes, attacks, battles, however you want to describe them, between Israel and southern Lebanon, Hezbollah specifically. Actually, Israeli attacks have gone deeper and deeper into Lebanon. But nevertheless, for all its ferocity, this conflict is on the Israeli Lebanese front is being characterized as a managed conflict with controlled escalation. So I just gave you my understanding of the US position, which is Gaza is all yours. We do not want a regional conflict. The Israelis look at it differently. As time has gone on and as their efforts to intimidate Hezbollah have failed, the Israelis have come to two conclusions. The first is that they want to resolve not only the challenge posed by the Palestinians, but also the challenge posed by Lebanon. And secondly, that they would ideally like to fight their regional enemies to the last American. What do I mean with that? The Americans have supposedly provided the following message to Israel: we're against a regional conflict. However, if your regional adversaries, Hezbollah or anyone else, launches a full scale war against Israel, we will stand with you and we will get directly involved to defend you. But we won't do that if you, Israel, are the one who initiates a full scale war. And when you see, in particularly the past few weeks, um, the increasingly brazen, if I may, Israeli escalations, such as hitting the
You
Iranian
may.
such as the Iranian diplomatic facility in the Syrian capital Damascus, striking deep into the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. I suspect there's an Israeli calculation that their wet dream of provoking a direct confrontation between the United States and Israel is now on the agenda. And it may well have been their calculation that although the US has enunciated the position that they will only get directly involved on Israel's behalf if others initiate war with Israel, that they feel that, that particularly in a U.S. election year, given the other regional complications and so on, that even if Israel initiates such a war by launching provocations that others can't ignore, that the U.S. is not going to sit back and say, we warned you, and do nothing while rockets are being fired from Lebanon at Tel Aviv, for example. So that would be the first part of my response. The second part is that as far as Iran is concerned, as you suggested, it's between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, it has to find an appropriate response to this latest Israeli provocation, because from its perspective, if it leaves these attacks unanswered, it's effectively encouraging to escalate yet further. At the same time, also, as you mentioned, Iran does not want a full scale war at this stage, either with Israel or with the United States. And it doesn't want to give Israel and the United States the pretext to do so. So I'm certain the Iranians are going to respond because, from their perspective, they can't allow this to go unanswered. How they respond, where they respond, will their response be effective in punishing Israel and deterring Israel from further such attacks, while at the same time avoiding a full scale conflict is, I think, more difficult to predict at this point. But having said that, Israel's conduct these past few weeks does very clearly provide an indication that they have, in effect, made a policy decision for full scale regional conflict. And my related observation would be if we look at the latest US decisions regarding weapons deliveries for Israel, we're talking about massive, an 18 billion package of weaponry and ordnance and ammunition going to Israel in one go. That's not to invade Rafah. Israel has everything it needs to continue pulverizing the Gaza Strip. I tend to suspect that at one level or another, there are senior figures in the Biden administration who are on board with Israel's regional intentions.
Which puts the rhetoric coming out of Washington in a very odd space, right?
Yes, because as I said, initially the U.S. was very wary of any regional escalation. It was concerned that Israel did not have the capacity for a two-front war, which I think was a correct assessment. It did not want to see a situation where it would be in any direct confrontation with Iran. But what has happened in the past few months is the U.S. is already directly involved. You have what's called Operation Prosperity Guardian in the Red Sea, and repeated US UK bombing raids on Yemen. There was a real concern that those would lead to the collapse of the peace process in Yemen. That doesn't appear to have happened. There have also been attacks on US forces in Syria and Iraq by pro Iranian militias in those countries. So it may well be, you have people like Brett McGurk and a few others who kind of see the Middle East through the prism of how can we support Israel and weaken Iran. And these are people who may well be on board with this Israeli agenda of a regional apocalypse.
I'm going to ask you one last question. Well,
Mhm.
actually, it is something that we had agreed to address, which is what's next. And it comports with a question from someone who's watching. And if you can answer both, what's next in terms of the sorts of things you'd like to address, it's up to you. But also, do you think, and this person's asking, do you think Israel and the US, and now they're even in the questions, they're placed in the same category, will go ahead with the Rafah invasion?
Um, to take the second, well, I guess those are related questions. It's difficult to say. First of all, Rafah is already being pulverized from the air on a daily basis. The question is whether Israel launches a ground operation in Rafah. And I think there are several factors to take into consideration. First of all, Rafah abuts the Egyptian border, and that could create potentially serious complications in Egyptian Israeli relations, particularly if the Israelis accidentally breach the barrier between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, and all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of Palestinians begin streaming into the Sinai Peninsula. The second is that there are indications that Israel at present does not have the manpower required for a meaningful ground offensive into Rafah. They have demobilized large numbers of reserves. Other units are due for rotation and so on. And so there are suggestions among military analysts that Israel, at least at present, does not have the capacity to launch a ground operation in Rafah. And that what we're seeing here is Netanyahu playing to the domestic gallery in Israel by insisting he needs to go into Rafah and then blaming the United States, the most anti-Israeli state in history, apparently, blaming Biden and the United States for rather than his own weakness, for his inability to launch this operation. This will play well domestically in Israel. It's never their fault; it's always someone else's fault, and will also play well domestically in the U.S. Because it gives ammunition to the Republicans in the upcoming U.S. elections. So that seems to be where things stand, and particularly when you take into consideration regional escalation, Israel may be even less inclined to send significant numbers of troops into Rafah. And add to that, they have gone into the northern Gaza Strip. They have gone into Gaza City. They have gone into Khan Yunis. And in all these cases, yes, they inflict damage and they degrade. But as soon as they leave, Hamas and the other movements reemerge. So briefly, what is so it may still happen. It doesn't appear likely in the short term, but even if it doesn't, keep your eye on the daily pulverization of Rafah from the air. And finally, again, these 7 foreign staff members of World Central Kitchen may not have died in vain, particularly if their murder is helps to forestall such an offensive into Rafah. In terms of what to expect in the coming period, I would argue regional escalation will continue. I find the prospect of a full blown regional conflict not certain, but increasingly likely. And in terms of what we're seeing in the Gaza Strip, I fear that we will continue seeing more of the same for the foreseeable future, because the fundamental issue at stake here, which are the efforts of the United States and the Europeans to inscribe Israeli impunity as a foundational principle of 21st century international law, has not yet ended. But there is one issue that gives me hope in the current atmosphere, and that is that traditionally kowtowing to Israel and slobbering all over Israel and its most extreme policies, has been considered a vote winner in Western democracies. In other words, pandering to Israel and its lobbies has been considered an electoral asset. What we're seeing in the past 6 months, and it's a very significant change, is that aligning with Israel, standing with the Israeli government, endorsing blindly its policies towards the Palestinian people, has become an electoral liability rather than an electoral asset. And I think particularly the long term significance of that development is not to be underestimated.
I'm trying to avoid getting too specific, and
Mhm.
actually, I want to engage with you and talk back and forth, and we do this off air all the time. But do you think that an expansion of the war to the regional level is possible without a very significant and hurtful hit by Iran towards Israel? Is there a
Yeah.
chance that is there a chance that this regional war might take place without such a hit? And if that's the case, if the answer is no, aren't the trade-offs clear for Iran in terms of, I guess, dignity versus destruction, or some form of destruction? Because obviously the Israel is going to probably go all out. It will never, in my view, find another opportunity as the one it has now, because the standing of Israel globally has never been as poor, as low, at the same time that it has the opportunity right now to shift the gaze.
Yes. Well, if your question is a firm Iranian response to Israel's attack on its embassy in Damascus a precondition for a regional eruption, I would argue that while it would certainly help, no, it's not a precondition. I can envision such a regional conflagration even without an Iranian response to the latest Israeli attack. And here's why: because for months now, on an almost daily basis, Israeli leaders have been repeatedly stating that this war will not be over unless and until they have cut Hezbollah down to size, that they are determined to do so, and that whatever happens in Gaza, meaning even if their war against the Gaza Strip comes to an end, that will have no bearing on their determination to deal once and for all with Hezbollah. Well, this may be just bluff and bluster, um, but if you look at it from Hezbollah's perspective, they now also have a choice. Um, will they simply sit back and wait until Israel decides that Israel is in the opportune position to attack Hezbollah? Or will they perhaps say, well, if such a war is indeed inevitable, why should we wait until it's best for Israel to launch it? And why shouldn't we then take all these existential threats being directed at us seriously? And here I would point out that Israeli leaders on an almost daily basis have been saying that they can do to Beirut what they have done to Gaza City, which is effectively total destruction and leveling it to the ground. Yes, that's true. Um, but Tel Aviv can also begin to resemble uh, Gaza City if Israel makes good on that threat. And so I think you take these multiple dynamics, also looking at what's happening in the Red Sea and so on. From my perspective, a generalized regional crisis is increasingly likely. It will certainly be helped along by a decisive Iranian response to Israel's latest attack, but I don't think it's dependent upon it.
Thanks, Mouin. We have a couple of questions, although a lot of people are not actually putting the word question next to, and I'm not sure if these are comments or back and forth on the chat. But we do have questions, more questions on the ICJ. We do have questions about parallels between different genocidal uh, actions and campaigns, and then we have questions on the media. Let me just say that we will be addressing the question of the media in a separate teaching completely, and how the media has shifted in many ways, even in the United States. I'm not sure about the German media. It seems to me that the German media will be the last to start recognizing where things are going. But in the US, the shift has taken place. So we will address this directly and exhaustively soon. Um, I'll spare you some of the questions about the parallels between different genocidal campaigns, because that takes us into a whole different conversations. We are dealing with this particular genocide right now, and we cannot even finish talking about it. And besides that, Mouin, if there are any other issues you'd like to raise or close with, I'll give you the floor. And we already are at 75 minutes, so I will not
No,
keep you much longer.
no, just as a final observation, this remains, just as it always has been, about Israeli impunity and the refusal of Israel's Western sponsors and allies to hold Israel accountable for its actions. That is now beginning to once again cost the lives of their own citizens. But ultimately, um, the issue remains unchanged. Will Israel be able to do whatever it wants without any restraints, without any inhibitions? Or will the same standards that we expect of the rest of the world finally begin to be applied to Israel as well? And I'm done.
Thank you, Mouin, again for always being as lucid as can be, and providing us with these updates that kind of pierce through the fog of social media news analysis and what have you, and address the matters in ways that actually has a long shelf life. I remember our conversations a few months ago, and uh, over time, and they all do, for the most part, stand the test of time. In fact, overwhelmingly so. So
Thank you.
I appreciate that, and I hope we can talk again soon. Thanks to all who have joined us. Please feel free to visit palestineincontext.org. We have now upwards of I don't know, 42 teachings and lectures and events addressing the war on Gaza and the unfolding genocide in ways that probably not completely comprehensive, but pretty exhaustive in various ways. Um, we also will be finalizing our curation of these teachings and videos, so that people can pick and choose segments, because each is, as you can tell, about 75 to 90 minutes, sometimes more. And we will see you again next Monday at 3 p.m. EST with Fadi Juda, who will be addressing his own book, and will be addressing poetry and literature on Gaza. He'll be doing a reading from his most recent volume. I'll be co-moderating with Fida Adeli this Monday at 3 p.m. And then next Thursday at 1 p.m. EST, back in the States, we will be holding the second installment in the series In Defense of Academic Freedom. And we will be hosting the or two people who have been dismissed from their jobs, and they will be joining us to address their cases. You might have seen a number of petitions and letters addressing their situation. So we will address that very shortly. I will keep the names until we actually put out the announcement. Thanks to all. Assalamu alaikum. Bonsoir. Good night.
Thank you, Bassam.